My husband was a billionaire, until his obsession with panties cost him everything. What looked like a perfect life collapsed overnight. My husband was a billionaire, powerful, admired, untouchable. But behind the money, there was a secret so destructive that it cost him everything. It started with small signs I ignored. Then came the truth: hidden purchases, secret accounts, and an obsession he never thought would surface. Panties were just the beginning. The real betrayal was the lies, the risks, and the empire he gambled away. When everything fell apart, I didn't scream or beg. I watched, I documented, I waited. And when the truth finally came out, I walked away with my dignity, my future, and my voice. If this story helps you understand that no amount of wealth can hide the truth forever, please leave a like and subscribe. There are marriages that end with dramatic revelations of infidelity or abuse, betrayals that arrive with clear names and obvious villains, and then there are marriages that collapse under the weight of something so bizarre and compulsive that even as you're discovering it, you can barely believe what you're seeing. My marriage to Alexander Chen, tech billionaire, venture capitalist, someone whose name appeared regularly in Forbes and whose opinions shaped industries, ended not because of another woman or violence or the typical catalysts for wealthy divorces. It ended because I discovered that my brilliant, powerful husband had a compulsive disorder so severe and so carefully hidden that by the time I uncovered it, he'd already jeopardized his entire empire, our financial security, and his reputation through behavior he apparently couldn't control despite having every resource imaginable to seek help. My name is Victoria Chen, and I'm 38 years old. I was married to Alexander for 11 years. 11 years during which I believed we had an exceptional life, built on his extraordinary success and our partnership in maintaining the lifestyle and social position that success afforded. Alexander had founded a cybersecurity company in his 20s that he'd sold for $900 million, then built a venture capital firm that had grown his wealth to approximately $3.4 billion through aggressive investments in emerging technologies. He was brilliant, driven, someone who approached business with strategic precision that made him enormously successful and respected within tech and finance circles. Our life together was everything wealth could provide: a penthouse apartment in Manhattan, homes in the Hamptons and Aspen, private jets and luxury cars, social circles that included other billionaires and influential people, access to experiences and opportunities most people could never imagine. I'd left my own career in art curation to manage our household and social obligations, to be the polished, supportive wife that Alexander's position required, to maintain the perfect exterior that wealth and success demanded. From outside, we appeared to have an ideal marriage: beautiful, wealthy, powerful, admired. But about 2 years before everything collapsed, I started noticing small things that didn't fit the perfect picture. Packages would arrive at our apartment addressed to Alexander with return addresses from lingerie companies and boutique clothing stores. When I'd ask about them, Alexander would say they were gifts he was buying for female business associates or for charitable donations. Explanations that were plausible enough that I accepted them without deeper investigation. He'd started traveling more frequently for business, trips to cities where his firm had investments, overnight stays that he said were necessary for deal negotiations or board meetings. I also noticed that Alexander had become more protective of his phone and computer, would close browsers when I entered rooms, would take calls in private that he said were sensitive business discussions. His credit card statements, which I occasionally reviewed as part of managing our household finances, showed charges I didn't recognize at stores I'd never heard of, amounts that were significant, but not large enough to create immediate concern given our substantial wealth. When I'd ask about specific charges, Alexander would provide vague explanations about business expenses or purchases for properties we owned, answers that were technically possible, but that felt increasingly evasive. The pattern that emerged over months was that Alexander was hiding something, spending significant money on items or activities he didn't want me to know about, maintaining some dimension of his life that he'd deliberately separated from our shared existence. My first assumption, like most wives in my position, was that he was having an affair. The hidden packages, the unexplained travel, the secretive phone behavior, the defensive reactions when questioned, All of it fit the profile of someone maintaining a relationship with another woman. I felt hurt and betrayed by what I believed was infidelity, but I also felt strangely unsurprised given how often wealth and power seemed to correlate with marital betrayal among the people in our social circle. I hired a private investigator to document Alexander's activities, to provide evidence of the affair I was certain was happening so I could make informed decisions about my marriage and my future. The investigator, a discreet professional named Michael Torres who specialized in high-net-worth cases, conducted surveillance for 3 weeks, following Alexander during his travels and documenting his activities. What Michael discovered was so unexpected and bizarre that when he presented his findings, I initially thought there must be some mistake or misunderstanding. Alexander wasn't having an affair, at least not a romantic or sexual relationship with another person. What he was doing was compulsively purchasing women's lingerie and clothing, accumulating massive quantities of these items, storing them in a secret apartment he'd rented under a false name, and apparently spending hours there engaging in behavior that Michael's surveillance couldn't fully document, but that clearly involved the clothing he'd accumulated. The purchases weren't for anyone else. They were for Alexander himself, part of compulsive behavior that had apparently been escalating over several years to the point where it was consuming significant portions of his time and substantial amounts of money. The investigator's report included surveillance photos of Alexander entering and leaving the secret apartment, documentation of his purchases from dozens of lingerie and clothing stores, financial records showing he'd spent over $7 million over 3 years on these compulsive purchases, evidence of credit cards and bank accounts opened under false identities to hide the spending from me and from business associates who might have access to his primary financial information. The scale of the compulsion was staggering. Michael estimated there were thousands of items stored in the apartment, far more than any one person could ever wear, quantities that indicated this wasn't about cross-dressing or gender exploration, but about compulsive acquisition that had spiraled completely out of control. I sat in Michael's office looking at surveillance photos of my billionaire husband entering an apartment carrying shopping bags from La Perla and Agent Provocateur, reading financial documentation showing millions spent on lingerie and women's clothing, trying to process that the secret Alexander had been hiding wasn't infidelity, but rather compulsive disorder, so severe it had required elaborate infrastructure of false identities and hidden apartments to maintain. The revelation was bizarre in ways that made it almost impossible to discuss. How do you explain to friends or family that your powerful, successful husband has been compulsively buying women's underwear at a rate that would be concerning even for someone actually wearing the items, let alone for someone apparently just accumulating them compulsively? But beyond the bizarreness was something much more serious. Alexander's compulsion had led him to commit financial fraud. The false identities he'd created to hide his purchases, the credit cards opened under fake names, the shell companies established to process payments, all of this constituted identity fraud and financial crimes that could have serious legal consequences if discovered. He'd been so desperate to hide his compulsive behavior that he'd risked criminal prosecution, had created paper trail of fraudulent activities that could destroy not just his reputation, but his freedom. I also discovered through Michael's investigation that Alexander's compulsion had started affecting his business judgment in ways that were jeopardizing his venture capital firm. He'd been making increasingly risky investments, had been distracted during important negotiations, had delegated critical decisions to subordinates while he was engaged with his compulsive activities. Several major deals had fallen through due to Alexander's inattention, and the firm's performance had declined noticeably over the past 18 months. A decline that business media had attributed to market conditions, but that was actually a result of Alexander's deteriorating focus and judgment as his compulsion consumed more of his mental and temporal resources. Armed with comprehensive documentation of Alexander's activities, I consulted with a divorce attorney who specialized in high-net-worth cases involving complex assets and unusual circumstances. The attorney, a formidable woman named Patricia Morrison, reviewed all the evidence Michael had gathered and explained my options carefully. Your husband has a serious psychological disorder that's led him to commit financial crimes, and that's affecting his business competence, Patricia said bluntly. You can approach this several ways. You can confront him privately and encourage him to seek treatment while staying in the marriage. You can confront him and demand he seek treatment as condition of staying married. Or you can document everything, protect your financial interests, and file for divorce while reporting his fraudulent activities to appropriate authorities. Each approach has different implications for you legally and financially. I thought carefully about my options over the following days. Part of me felt Alexander deserved compassion. Compulsive disorders are psychological conditions requiring treatment, not moral failings to be condemned. If he'd had cancer or another physical illness, I would have supported him through treatment without question. But I couldn't ignore that Alexander had chosen to hide his condition rather than seeking help, had committed crimes to conceal his compulsive behavior, had jeopardized our financial security and his business through his deteriorating judgment, and had lied to me systematically for years while I'd trusted him completely. The combination of psychological disorder, criminal activity, and comprehensive deception made staying in the marriage feel impossible. I also had to consider my own future and protection. Alexander's fraudulent activities could potentially expose me to legal liability if I knew about them and didn't report them. His business decisions, while mentally compromised, could destroy the wealth our lifestyle depended on. His compulsion showed no signs of improving without intervention, and his pattern of hiding and lying suggested he wasn't going to seek help voluntarily. Staying married to Alexander while he spiraled further into compulsive behavior and criminal activity seemed like accepting slow-motion disaster rather than protecting myself while I still could. I made my decision. I would document everything comprehensively, protect my financial interests through legal mechanisms, file for divorce, and report Alexander's fraudulent financial activities to appropriate authorities. The approach was strategic rather than emotional, focused on protecting myself and ensuring Alexander would be forced to confront his disorder through legal consequences if he wouldn't address it voluntarily. Patricia helped me execute this plan meticulously over several weeks, securing my share of marital assets, documenting Alexander's activities and their impact on his business judgment, preparing divorce papers that would protect me from liability for his fraudulent conduct. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday evening when I knew Alexander had no travel planned and would be home for dinner. I waited until we'd finished eating, then calmly presented him with printed copies of the surveillance photos, the financial documentation, the evidence of his secret apartment and his compulsive purchases. I watched his face go through shock, fear, calculation, and finally a kind of defeated resignation as he realized the extent of what I'd discovered and documented. "I know about the apartment," I said directly. "I know about the millions you've spent on lingerie and clothing. I know about the false identities and the fraudulent accounts. I know your compulsion has been affecting your business judgment and jeopardizing the firm. And I've already consulted with attorneys about divorce and about reporting your fraudulent activities to the appropriate authorities. This marriage is over, Alexander. The only question is whether you're going to seek help for your compulsive disorder or whether you're going to continue hiding and lying until the legal consequences become unavoidable." Alexander tried several responses. Denial initially, though the evidence made that impossible to sustain. Minimizing, claiming the behavior wasn't as serious as it appeared. Justification, trying to explain the compulsion as stress relief or harmless hobby that had just gotten slightly out of hand. But I'd prepared for all these deflections, had evidence that made each attempted rationalization obviously inadequate. Eventually, Alexander broke down, admitted he had compulsive disorder he'd been struggling with for years, said he'd been too ashamed to seek help, too afraid of what treatment would mean for his reputation and his business. "I'm not staying married to you," I said firmly, when Alexander started pleading for another chance. "You've been lying to me for years. You've committed crimes to hide your compulsion. You've jeopardized our financial security through your deteriorating business judgment. Maybe you have psychological disorder that deserves compassion, but you also made choices to hide rather than seek help, to commit fraud rather than be honest, to risk everything rather than address your problems. Those choices have consequences, and one of those consequences is that this marriage is over." I moved out that night, staying in a hotel while the divorce proceedings began. Alexander's life unraveled rapidly once the truth about his compulsion became known. Business partners at his venture capital firm discovered his fraudulent financial activities and his declining judgment, forced him out of leadership positions, demanded he sell his stake in the firm. News of his bizarre compulsion leaked to media, probably through people at the firm who were angry about his deception, and became scandal that dominated business news cycles for weeks. The billionaire who'd been admired for his strategic brilliance became object of mockery and speculation, his reputation destroyed by behavior that seemed almost impossible to believe, despite being documented comprehensively. Federal prosecutors investigated Alexander's fraudulent financial activities, the false identities, the credit cards opened under fake names, the shell companies created to hide transactions. He eventually pleaded guilty to identity fraud and financial crimes, received 3 years probation and substantial fines rather than prison time, but had to register as convicted felon with all the social and professional consequences that entailed. His business career was effectively over. No legitimate firm would partner with someone convicted of financial fraud. No investors would trust someone whose judgment had been so compromised by untreated compulsion. The divorce proceedings were complex given the size of Alexander's wealth and the unusual circumstances of our separation. I fought for and received significant settlement, $340 million, approximately 10% of Alexander's remaining wealth, after his business partners had forced him to sell his stake in the firm at disadvantageous terms. Patricia had successfully argued that I deserved substantial settlement, both as compensation for 11 years of marriage and as recognition that Alexander's concealment of his disorder and criminal activities had been form of marital fraud that warranted more than standard equal division of assets. The settlement gave me financial security beyond anything I'd imagined, wealth that would allow me to build whatever life I wanted without depending on anyone else. But more valuable than the money was the dignity I'd maintained throughout the process. I hadn't stayed in denial, hadn't accepted Alexander's lies and minimization, hadn't sacrificed my own well-being to protect his reputation or our lifestyle. I'd recognized that the perfect life we appeared to have was built on comprehensive deception, had documented the truth methodically, had made strategic decisions to protect myself rather than emotional decisions based on loyalty to someone who'd betrayed that loyalty fundamentally. 3 years after discovering Alexander's secret and leaving him, I'm 41 and rebuilt into a life that's simpler but more authentic than what I had during my marriage. I live in a beautiful home I own outright, travel extensively, have returned to work in art curation part-time because I find it meaningful rather than because I need the income. I've reconnected with friends who knew me before I was Alexander Chen's wife, have built identity based on my own interests and values rather than on performing role as wealthy man's perfect partner. Alexander, from what I hear through mutual acquaintances, has sought treatment for his compulsive disorder, has been in intensive therapy for several years, has apparently achieved some level of recovery, though relapse remains constant risk with compulsive disorders. He lives much more modestly now. The wealth he retained after his business forced him out, and after our divorce settlement was substantial, but nothing like what he'd had before, and his criminal record and destroyed reputation mean he'll never have the power and influence he once commanded. His compulsion cost him everything: his marriage, his business, his reputation, his position among the elite he'd worked his entire life to join. What I learned from discovering Alexander's secret is that wealth and power don't protect people from psychological disorders, that compulsive behavior can coexist with strategic brilliance in ways that make it nearly impossible to detect until it's progressed to destructive levels, that no amount of success or intelligence prevents someone from making catastrophically bad decisions. When they're consumed by compulsion, they're too ashamed to address openly. I'd been married to one of the world's most successful people, someone whose wealth seemed to make him invincible, someone whose strategic thinking had built empire worth billions. But behind that success was vulnerability he couldn't acknowledge, disorder he couldn't control, shame that prevented him from seeking help until legal and personal consequences forced intervention he'd avoided for years. The panties, the thousands of pieces of lingerie and women's clothing Alexander had compulsively accumulated, were just the visible symbol of disorder that ran much deeper. The real betrayal wasn't the specific items he'd been buying, but the lies he'd told to conceal the buying, the crimes he'd committed to hide the evidence, the risks he'd taken with our financial security and his business. The years of systematic deception that had made our entire marriage a performance rather than genuine partnership. When everything fell apart, when the perfect life revealed itself as facade concealing compulsion and crime, I didn't scream or beg for explanations or try to save something that had been fundamentally false. I watched. I documented. I waited for the right moment to act. And when that moment came, I walked away with my dignity, my future, and my voice intact. My name is Victoria Chen. My husband was a billionaire, brilliant, powerful, admired by everyone who knew him professionally. But behind the success was compulsive disorder so severe he spent millions on lingerie. He compulsively accumulated, committed financial fraud to hide the purchases, jeopardized his business through deteriorating judgment his compulsion caused. When I discovered the truth, I documented everything methodically, protected my financial interests strategically, filed for divorce, and reported his fraudulent activities. His life collapsed. His business partners forced him out. Prosecutors convicted him of financial crimes. Media destroyed his reputation through coverage of bizarre compulsion he'd hidden for years. But I walked away with $340 million settlement and something more valuable: my dignity and my freedom from marriage built on comprehensive deception. What looked like perfect life collapsed overnight. But what emerged from the collapse was truth, consequences, and possibility of building something real rather than continuing to live in beautiful lie. Thank you for reading. If this story helps you understand that no amount of wealth can hide the truth forever, please like and subscribe.